David Montgomery is a man everyone in San Francisco knows, but no one truly understands. A millionaire CEO in a cold steel mansion, David has everything money can buy, except family. One bitter winter afternoon, a shivering little girl selling sandwiches outside a train station catches his eye, not for what she's selling, but for what she says. "I'm not begging, sir. I'm earning money to buy my mom's medicine." David offers to help, but then she says her mother's name, Isabelle Montgomery, and just like that, his past punches through the present. When the girl pulls out a faded photo, David's heart nearly stops. It's him, with Isabelle, a love he abandoned years ago, a choice that may have cost him more than he ever imagined. Now he's faced with the unthinkable, a daughter he never knew existed, a woman he once loved, now dying, and a second chance wrapped in guilt, love, and the kind of redemption that can't be bought. Will he finally become the man he should have been? Or is it too late to rewrite a broken legacy? Hit play to discover a powerful story about lost love, fatherhood, and healing the wounds that time never erased. Subscribe for more emotionally gripping stories that touch your heart and leave you breathless. David Montgomery had built an empire from silence. Silent boardrooms, silent agreements, silent nights in his hilltop mansion overlooking San Francisco. The glass walls of his home reflected the cold perfection of a life lived in spreadsheets and strategies. There was no laughter echoing down his marbled halls, no muddy shoes by the door, no warmth clinging to the scent of dinner. Just him, a poured glass of scotch, and a calendar that had nothing on it except work. At 51, David had everything people said they wanted: helicopter commutes, an ocean view office, invitations to black-tie galas. But somewhere along the way, he had lost the parts of life you couldn't put in a contract. The day had been cruel. Rain lashed the sidewalks like a reminder that not all storms were internal. His divorce, finalized 2 years ago, had barely made a ripple in his routine, but it had carved something hollow into him. No children, no shared memories that mattered, just settlement checks and silence. David's car, a black Jaguar with more tech than his first 5 startups, pulled into the curb beside the old train station. His driver, Marcus, turned slightly. "We'll be home in 15, sir." David nodded absently. "Actually, hold up a second." Through the rain-speckled window he had seen movement, a flash of color against the gray. A small figure hunched under a makeshift cardboard umbrella, holding up a basket covered in plastic wrap. A little girl. She couldn't have been more than 9. Her coat was too thin, soaked through, and her sneakers were torn at the sides. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the sign taped to her basket. "Homemade sandwiches. $3. Help my mom." David frowned. He didn't carry cash. He didn't stop for anything that wasn't scheduled. But something in the girl's eyes pierced him. Earnest, focused, determined not to beg, only to sell. He rolled down the window. "Hey," he called gently, his voice rough from disuse outside boardrooms. The girl looked up, startled. Her eyes were a brilliant hazel, made brighter by the rain. "Sir, would you like a sandwich? They're still warm." David hesitated, glanced at Marcus, then back at the girl. "How long have you been out here?" She wiped her sleeve across her forehead. "Since lunch. But it's okay. I need to sell 12 more to help my mom buy her medicine." That word, medicine, punched something loose in David's chest. "What's your name?" he asked softly, stepping out into the rain before Marcus could protest. The girl blinked up at him, clutching the basket. "Sophie." "And your mom?" Sophie tilted her head. "Isabelle Montgomery." The world stopped. David's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard that name in more than a decade, but he hadn't forgotten it. Not the way she laughed. Not the way she had walked away from him, quietly, painfully, when he chose ambition over love. "Isabelle?" he asked, voice almost cracking. "You sure?" Sophie nodded, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, weather-worn photo. "She said I could show this if I ever got scared." She handed it to him. David took it with trembling fingers. The photo was faded, creased in 3 places, but he recognized it instantly. Him, standing beside Isabelle, arms around her waist on a beach in Monterey. His face was younger, freer, unaware of the price success would one day demand. Sophie shifted, suddenly uncertain. "You okay, mister?" David swallowed hard, returning the photo. Yeah, I'm okay." But he wasn't. The ground beneath his polished shoes felt unsteady. "Do you want a sandwich?" Sophie asked again, voice smaller now. "It's still warm." David reached into his coat for his wallet but stopped. "Actually, could I walk you home? I'd like to meet your mom." Sophie studied him for a long second, the way children do when they're not sure whether to trust. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but it's kind of far. We live in the Mission, in that old building behind the drugstore." He didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." As they began walking, her small steps beside his long stride, something unfamiliar pressed into David's heart, a flicker of something lost, now returned. Not just memory, not just guilt. Hope. The rain softened to a mist as David Montgomery followed Sophie down the cracked sidewalks of San Francisco's Mission District. He walked a half step behind her, unsure of how to speak or where to start. Sophie, seemingly used to moving through wet streets with quiet confidence, clutched her sandwich basket to her chest and adjusted the hood of her coat. David couldn't stop glancing at her. Every small motion, the way she scrunched her nose at the cold, the way her feet moved quickly to dodge puddles, brought back flashes of a woman he hadn't seen in nearly 10 years. Isabelle. They'd met at a charity fundraiser back when he still believed in the magic of chance encounters. She'd been working the event, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres with a grace that made him pause. He had just made partner at his firm. She was finishing her nursing degree. Their worlds weren't supposed to align, but they had, beautifully, briefly. And now, the girl beside him might be their daughter. Sophie didn't speak much on the walk, only glancing up every so often to make sure he was still behind her. David wasn't sure if he was more afraid of what he'd find, or what he might feel. Finally, they stopped in front of a weathered building wedged between a pawn shop and a boarded-up bakery. The awning above the entrance sagged from years of rain. Paint peeled from the siding like tired skin. "This is it," Sophie said, voice soft. "We're on the 2nd floor, number 2B. David's heart twisted. "Do you live here alone, with your mom?" Sophie nodded. "Just us?" Then she hesitated. "Sometimes Miss Janice from downstairs checks on us if Mom's real sick, but I take care of most things." The casual way she said it broke something in David. He opened the rusted gate and followed her up the narrow stairs. The hall smelled of old carpets and fried onions. At the door of 2B, Sophie paused, balancing her basket with one arm as she fished out a key from a shoelace tied around her neck. "Don't be loud, okay?" she said gently. "Mom's sleeping." David nodded, silent. Sophie pushed open the door. The apartment was small. Just one bedroom, a kitchenette, and a couch that looked like it had survived a decade of hard years. A flickering floor lamp lit the room with a warm, yellow glow. On the far wall, children's drawings were taped in uneven rows. Stick figures, rainbows, a large heart labeled Mom and Me. On the couch, under a worn blanket, lay Isabelle. Her hair was shorter now, and her cheeks more hollow. But even through the weight of illness, her beauty remained. Her hands, so graceful once, were folded across her chest. Her breathing was shallow but steady. David felt as though someone had reached into his chest and squeezed. Sophie stepped close, placing a hand on her mother's shoulder. "Mom," she whispered. "Someone's here." Isabelle stirred slowly, her eyelids fluttering open. She blinked, disoriented, then focused on Sophie. A soft smile formed. "Hey, baby. Did you sell any?" Sophie nodded. "Almost all, and... Mom, look." Isabelle followed her daughter's gesture. When her eyes landed on David, she froze. For a long moment, nothing moved, just the sound of a leaky faucet and the ticking of a second-hand clock. Then Isabelle sat up slightly, pain etched across her face. "David?" He stepped forward, words catching in his throat. "Hi, Izzy." Her eyes filled. "What are you doing here?" I saw Sophie. She offered me a sandwich, and then she said your name." Isabelle laughed once, short and tired. "I guess fate finally remembered we weren't finished." David wanted to say so many things, apologies, regrets, questions, but all he managed was, "Is she... mine?" Isabelle looked at Sophie, who now stood at the window, giving them quiet space. Her eyes softened. Yes. David sat slowly on the edge of a worn chair. "Why didn't you tell me?" "You made it clear what mattered to you," she replied, not bitterly, just truthfully. "You were building an empire. I was a detour." "That's not true," he said immediately, but she simply looked at him, eyes kind but tired. "I didn't want Sophie to grow up waiting for someone who might never show up." David swallowed hard. "I didn't know. Izzy, if I had... But you didn't," she interrupted gently. Silence settled between them. David reached for her hand, frail, cold, but still the same hand that had once held his. "I'm here now." A small sound from Sophie drew their attention. She stood quietly, arms crossed over her chest, eyes wide with something fragile, hope, maybe, or fear. David stood slowly, walking to her side. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Sophie looked at her mom. Isabelle nodded softly. "Okay," Sophie said finally. It wasn't permission, not yet, but it was a start. And David, for the first time in years, felt like maybe he'd finally found the part of his life that mattered more than success. The next morning, David arrived at the apartment with a grocery bag clutched in one hand and nerves balled tight in his chest. He'd barely slept. His mind had run in circles all night, trying to reconcile the two versions of his life, the one he had built from ambition, and the one he'd left behind in the form of a child with his eyes. He knocked gently, and for a moment he worried no one would answer. But then the door creaked open, and there stood Sophie, clutching a sketchpad to her chest. "You came back," she said, her voice quieter than yesterday's. David nodded, smiling gently. "I said I would." Sophie stepped aside to let him in. The apartment looked a little brighter today. The same worn furniture, the same peeling wallpaper, but sunlight streamed through the small window, and a vase with 2 wilting daisies sat on the kitchen counter. Isabelle was sitting up on the couch, a blanket draped over her lap and a mug of tea cupped in her thin hands. Her face lit up faintly when she saw him. "David," she said, her voice raspy but warm. He walked over, setting the bag down. "I brought soup and some tea, and there's a little something for Sophie in there, too." "You didn't have to," Isabelle began. "I wanted to," he said firmly, cutting her off with a look that was both gentle and determined. "Let me do something. Anything." Sophie watched them from her chair at the table, sketchpad open now, pencil moving across the page. David tried not to stare too long, but he couldn't help it. She was a perfect blend of them both. Isabelle's soft cheekbones, his jawline, her curiosity, his intensity. He began, awkwardly, turning back to Isabelle. "I can help with errands. Groceries, medicine, whatever you need." Isabelle looked down into her mug. "It's been hard," she admitted softly. Dialysis 3 times a week. I had to quit my job. Rent's late again. Sophie's been the one holding us together. David felt the shame flood him again. That he had been 10 minutes away, living in a home with heated floors and panoramic views of the bay, while Isabelle and their daughter rationed groceries and scraped by on hope and willpower. "I want to help," he repeated. Isabelle didn't answer right away. When she did, her words came slowly. She doesn't know what a father is supposed to be. She only knows what it feels like not to have one. David's throat tightened. "I can't promise I'll do everything right," he said quietly, "but I'll be here, from now on." Sophie looked up at that, her gaze unreadable. "Do you know how to braid hair?" she asked suddenly. David blinked, surprised. "I don't, but I can learn." Sophie gave a small shrug and returned to her drawing. Isabelle chuckled softly, her laugh like wind chimes, faint but sweet. "She tests people. You're not the first to walk through that door, but you might be the first who came back." David sat beside her. "What happened to us, Izzy?" She sighed, looking out the window for a long moment. "You chased the world," she said quietly, "and I didn't want to be another thing you had to outrun to get it. I never stopped caring." "No, but you stopped choosing me." The words weren't cruel, just honest, and they landed like stones in David's chest. "I regret that," he whispered. "I regret everything I didn't fight for." They sat in silence after that, the weight of years pressing in on them. Outside, kids' laughter echoed from the street below. The scent of the soup David had brought began to fill the apartment. Sophie eventually came over, holding up her drawing. "This is you," she said, pointing to a tall stick figure with glasses and a tie. "And that's Mom. And that's me." David took it reverently, blinking fast. "You drew me?" She nodded, very seriously. "I put you in our story, but you have to stay. Otherwise, I'll erase you." His voice cracked. "Then I guess I better stay." He hung the drawing on the fridge with a magnet that said, "Love grows here," its paint chipped and faded. And in that moment, it felt like the most precious piece of art he'd ever owned. Later, after helping Isabelle to the kitchen table and watching her eat slowly, savoring every spoonful, David gathered the dishes. It was a small gesture, but Isabelle's eyes shimmered with quiet gratitude. Sophie curled up on the couch with a worn-out copy of Charlotte's Web. David sat beside her and asked gently, "Can I read it to you?" She shrugged. "Mom does the voices." "I can try," he offered. She tilted her head. "Okay, but the pig has to sound funny." David cleared his throat theatrically. "Hi, I'm Wilbur the Pig," he squeaked, making Sophie giggle behind her hand. And, as the late afternoon sun bathed the room in gold, David Montgomery, the man who once measured worth in boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, found himself learning how to read stories with silly voices to a child who somehow still had space in her heart to hope. David returned the next morning with a grocery bag balanced in one hand and a stack of books tucked under his arm. Children's books, parenting books, a beginner's cookbook. He'd spent half the night online, researching how to care for a child, how to support a partner with chronic illness, and how not to ruin pancakes. Sophie opened the door this time, already dressed for school in a slightly too small pink hoodie and jeans with a patch on one knee. She blinked up at him sleepily. "You're early." "I brought breakfast," David replied sheepishly, "and I was hoping I could walk you to school." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Only if you don't talk too loud. Mrs. Chan next door hates morning people." He grinned. "Got it. Silent mode." In the kitchen, Isabelle was up, moving slower than the day before, but clearly trying. She smiled weakly at the sight of David pouring batter into a pan. The pancakes came out lopsided and slightly burnt, but he served them with a flourish and a crooked smile that made Isabelle laugh softly. "You were always terrible at cooking," she teased. I'm trying to improve, David said, handing Sophie a plate. Cooking for one doesn't exactly inspire effort. Sophie doused her pancakes in syrup and took a big bite. Not bad, she mumbled. Could use more chocolate chips, though. Noted, David replied seriously. I'll level up next time. After breakfast, Sophie grabbed her backpack and David walked her the 6 blocks to her school. It was an old brick building with chipped paint and a playground that had clearly seen better decades. Other parents waited outside, some in cars, some waving from stoops, but David noticed Sophie walk ahead a little faster when they reached the gate. Hey, he said, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Is it okay that I'm here? She shrugged. Some kids don't have dads. Some do. You're just new. David knelt to her level. Sophie, I know I'm late, really late, but I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him for a long beat, then nodded slowly. Okay, but no kissing Mom in public. Gross. He laughed. Deal. After she disappeared through the doors, David turned and headed back to the apartment. It was still hard to wrap his head around the new shape of his life. Sophie's bright eyes, Isabelle's frailty, the weight of everything he'd missed. The man who once managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions now felt overwhelmed by a third grader's homework and the proper temperature to wash hair. Later that afternoon, he sat beside Isabelle on the couch, folding laundry while she rested. She watched him with a mix of amusement and disbelief as he struggled to match socks. You used to pay someone to do this, she murmured. I still might, he joked, holding up 2 wildly different socks. They both laughed. Then silence settled over them, not awkward, but familiar, comfortable. Do you ever regret it? She asked suddenly. All the choices? David looked down at the laundry in his lap. Every day now. Isabelle's eyes softened. You were chasing something. I get it. I thought success would fill the spaces inside me, he admitted quietly. But all I did was build walls. She nodded, her voice nearly a whisper, and we were on the other side. David reached over, gently taking her hand. I don't want to miss anything else. That night, he stayed late to help Sophie with her math homework. She sprawled across the floor with worksheets while David knelt awkwardly beside her, trying to remember how fractions worked. Why do I need to know this? She asked, frowning. Because someday you might want to open a bakery and you'll need to measure ingredients, he replied. Or own a castle, she countered, chin lifted defiantly. He smiled. In that case, you'll need to manage your treasure wisely. She giggled, then looked up at him. Do you really have a castle? David chuckled. Not exactly, but I do have a pretty big office. Can I visit it one day? He hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yeah. When things settle, I'd like that. As he packed up to leave, Sophie suddenly hugged him from behind, arms wrapped around his waist. Thanks for the pancakes, she whispered. David's heart swelled. He bent down, holding her gently. Thanks for giving me a second chance. When he stepped out into the cold night air, David paused on the stoop and looked up at the dark sky. A few stars peeked through the city's haze. He'd come a long way from the man who measured life by quarterly earnings and Forbes rankings. And yet, something told him, this was only the beginning. The apartment was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the heater rattling softly in the corner. It was Friday evening, and outside the streets of San Francisco buzzed with the kind of life David Montgomery used to thrive in. Cocktail parties, late-night meetings, corner offices with panoramic views. But inside this small, lived-in space, he sat, cross-legged on the floor, his tie gone, sleeves rolled up, helping Sophie glue glitter stars onto a shoebox diorama. What's this for again? He asked, examining the mess of pipe cleaners and sparkles that somehow resembled Saturn. Space Week, Sophie replied, her brows scrunched in fierce concentration. I picked Saturn because it has rings, like Mom's old earrings. David smiled, but there was a twist in his chest. Those earrings had been his gift to Isabelle one Christmas, when they were still young, still possible. Sophie placed a star in the corner of the box and leaned back, inspecting it critically. "I think it's done. I think it's amazing," David said honestly. "You have a good eye for details." Sophie shrugged. "Mom says I see what others don't." David looked at her, suddenly overcome with the weight of how much he'd missed. 9 years of birthdays, of bedtime stories, scraped knees, proud school projects. She'd grown up so much without him, because of him. He reached over, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "Sophie," he said softly, "can I ask you something?" She looked up, expectant. Do you think I could come see more of your school things? Not just Space Week, but whatever else you're doing?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she shifted on her knees and looked at him seriously, as if weighing the question far beyond her years. "Can I ask something too?" "Of course." Her voice was small, fragile. "Are you going to leave? Like the dad of my friend Elena? He came one day with toys and said he'd always be there, but he stopped showing up." David's throat closed. The sparkle glue on his fingers suddenly felt like cement, heavy and impossible to wipe away. He moved slowly, sitting beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "I don't know that man," he said quietly, "but I know I can't promise you I'll be perfect. I might get things wrong. I might even burn more pancakes." She cracked a small smile, but her eyes were locked on his. "But I won't leave. Not now, not ever again." She didn't say anything. She just leaned into him, resting her head against his side, her small body trembling slightly with the release of unspoken fear. David wrapped his arm around her, holding her tightly, protectively, and silently he cried, tears he hadn't shed in years. Not for the lost deals, or even the failed marriage, but for the time he had let slip away. The child he hadn't even known to miss. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed and Isabelle had drifted into a restless sleep on the couch, David sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen. A cup of untouched tea steamed beside him. The letter Isabelle had written to Sophie for the future sat on the table, the envelope unsealed. He hadn't read it, knew it wasn't his to open, but he couldn't stop looking at it. That single envelope held so much. Love, regret, hope. He could feel it radiating off the page like heat from a coal. His phone buzzed. A message from Melissa, his corporate VP. "The Singapore deal needs your approval by 9 a.m. Board expects you in Monday." David stared at the screen. Then he turned it face down. He didn't know how to be a full-time father yet, but he knew this. If he missed another moment like tonight, if he gave priority to a boardroom over a bedtime story, he'd lose more than just Sophie. He'd lose himself. And so, he stayed, through the night, dozing in the old recliner near the window, waking up every hour to check if Sophie needed another blanket, or if Isabelle stirred from her uneasy dreams. He wasn't a prince. He wasn't the man Isabelle used to believe he could be. But he was trying. Trying mattered. In the morning, he woke to the sound of soft humming. Sophie was setting the table with unmatched plates, gently placing 2 slices of toast on each. She glanced up and saw him watching. "I made breakfast," she said proudly. He rose slowly, his back aching, but his heart warm. "And it smells amazing," he said. They ate together, quietly, like they'd always done this, like it was normal, like they were a family, mending, slowly, deliberately. And in the silence, David knew. He didn't just want to be part of her life. He needed to be, permanently. The morning sun filtered through the blinds in streaks of gold and soft gray, cutting across the worn hardwood floors of the tiny apartment like quiet prayers. David sat at the kitchen table, his elbows resting on the edge, a mug of lukewarm coffee untouched between his hands. Across from him, Isabelle stirred gently on the couch, waking slowly from a night full of coughs and cold sweats. Sophie, dressed in her school clothes, quietly brushed her hair in the mirror by the door, humming the same off-key tune she always did when she was nervous. David had already promised to walk her to school, her first time with him by her side. She hadn't said much, but her small smile that morning had spoken volumes. "Morning," Isabelle murmured, voice rough with sleep and weakness. David looked up, instantly concerned. "How are you? Feeling?" She offered a tired smile. "Still here." He stood and walked over, kneeling beside her. "Did you take your meds?" She nodded, eyes closing for a moment. "You don't have to keep checking on me like this, David." "Yes, I do," he replied gently, brushing her hair back. "I should have been doing it long before now." She exhaled slowly, something between gratitude and guilt flickering in her expression. "I didn't reach out to hurt you. I didn't want Sophie to grow up waiting on a man who was never coming back." David's voice dropped to a whisper. "I wish you had told me." "I almost did, twice. But then I'd see another photo of you at some gala, another Forbes article calling you the King of Wall Street, and I thought, how could we fit into that?" David didn't answer. He couldn't, because she'd been right, until now. Sophie's voice cut through the thick silence. "Mom, can I wear the red scarf today?" "Of course, sweetheart," Isabelle called back with a smile. David turned to her quietly. "I want to help, Isabelle. Not just with doctor's appointments or bills. I want to be part of her life. Really, part of it." "You're not just saying that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not," he said. "You're sick. She needs someone who will always be there. I want to be that person." For a moment, Isabelle just looked at him. Then she nodded, slowly. "Then you better not mess this up, Montgomery." A breath of laughter escaped him. "Yes, ma'am." Later that morning, David walked Sophie to school. They moved at a leisurely pace through the city, Sophie holding his hand tightly like she wasn't sure he'd still be there if she let go. He answered all her questions, about why taxis are yellow, why squirrels seem angry all the time, and whether princesses could be scientists. "Absolutely," he said. "Some of the smartest women in the world wear crowns and lab coats." She beamed up at him. "Can I be one of those?" "You already are," he replied sincerely. At the school gate, she turned to face him. "You'll be here when I get out?" "Right here." "And tomorrow?" "And the day after that." She bit her lip, a flicker of worry still shadowing her eyes. "You promise?" David dropped to one knee, took both her small hands in his, and said with heartfelt conviction, "I promise, Sophie. I'm here to stay." The bell rang. She turned, ran toward the entrance, then suddenly stopped and came racing back. She threw her arms around him, hugged him tight, and whispered, "I missed you, even when I didn't know who you were." David held her close, heart clenching. "I missed you too, more than you'll ever know." He watched until she disappeared inside. Back at the apartment, Isabelle sat at the table, a small pile of paperwork in front of her, hospital forms, insurance rejections, pharmacy receipts. She looked up as David entered, his face radiant with something new, peace. "She ran back to hug me," he said softly, like he still didn't quite believe it. "She does that when she really trusts someone," Isabelle said, her voice faltering. David pulled out the chair beside her. "Let me take some of this off your plate." She looked at the papers. "It's a mess." "I've managed hedge funds across 3 continents. I think I can handle a few forms," he teased gently. Isabelle smiled faintly, but her eyes filled with tears. "You're really not going to leave again, are you?" "No," he said, reaching for her hand. "And if you'll let me, I want to be here for both of you, for everything, not just the easy parts." She squeezed his hand tightly. "Then we'll do this, together." And in that quiet room with its chipped counters and aging light fixtures, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, Just a soft, undeniable sense that this wasn't a second chance. It was the real beginning. The morning started with smoke and laughter. David stood frozen in front of the stove, a spatula dangling in one hand, a blackened pancake clinging to the pan like a bad decision. The smoke alarm wailed overhead in protest. Sophie peeked into the kitchen, her wide eyes blinking through the haze. Is breakfast on fire?" she asked carefully. David groaned, quickly waving a towel beneath the alarm until the shrill beeping ceased. "It was supposed to be pancakes. You know, fluffy, golden, edible." Sophie giggled, covering her mouth. "It's okay. Mom burns toast sometimes." Isabelle, wrapped in a faded cardigan, shuffled in just as David dumped the culinary casualty into the trash. "You're gonna set the place on fire," she teased, her voice hoarse but amused. David turned, sheepish. "In my defense, I haven't cooked for anyone in years." "I could have guessed," she said dryly, sitting at the small table. They settled for cereal and orange juice, with David pouring the milk too fast and making Sophie laugh again. It was the kind of messy, ordinary morning he'd never known he could miss. After breakfast, he helped Sophie with her math homework. She lay belly down on the living room rug, scribbling out multiplication problems while David sat beside her, pencil in hand, trying to recall third-grade arithmetic. "What's 9 times 6? She asked, brow furrowed. 54, he said after a pause. She looked up skeptically. "Are you guessing? I'm a CEO, not a calculator." "You should study more," she said with a mock stern tone that made him smile. Later that day, while Isabelle napped, David took Sophie to the bookstore downtown. It was her idea. "Mom loves stories," she explained. "When she's really tired, she can't read. So I do it." David stood in awe as she carefully selected 2 fairy tale books and a dog-eared mystery novel from the bargain shelf. "These," she said, "they make her smile." That evening, with dinner safely delivered from a nearby diner, the 3 of them curled up on the couch. Sophie handed David a worn book titled The Princess Who Didn't Need Saving. "You read it," she said, climbing onto his lap and snuggling close. "You have a funny voice." David cleared his throat. "Funny how?" Like when you're trying too hard to sound cool. It's funny." Isabelle laughed softly from the other end of the couch. "She's not wrong." David exaggerated his voice into a booming baritone, and Sophie burst into delighted giggles. As he read, she occasionally corrected him, whispered lines from memory, or asked why the knight didn't have to wear pink. When the story ended and Sophie was tucked into bed, she looked up at him in the dim light, her eyes suddenly serious. "Mr. David?" she said quietly. "Yeah?" "You're not like my friends' dads." David tensed. "How do you mean?" "They leave," she whispered. "Or yell, or never come to school stuff. You stayed, even after the pancake thing." His heart ached. He reached out and gently brushed her hair back. "I'm not going anywhere." She paused, then asked in a voice so small it broke him. "Then, why did you leave before? When I was a baby?" David's throat tightened. He sat down beside her, unsure of how to explain the weight of a mistake to a child so pure. "I didn't know," he began slowly. "Your mom and we lost touch. I didn't know you were out there needing me. If I had, I would have come. I would have run to you." Sophie stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." "Okay?" he asked, unsure what that meant. "Okay means I believe you, but if you lie, I'll know." He chuckled, eyes misting. "Deal." She rolled over, pulling the blanket to her chin. "Good night, Mr. David." "Good night, Sophie." He lingered at the doorway after turning out the light. Isabelle stood quietly behind him. "She asks the hard stuff," Isabelle murmured, arms crossed. "She deserves the truth," he said. They sat on the couch again, the silence soft between them. Isabelle looked down at her hands. She adores you already. I don't deserve it, he said. No, she agreed. But maybe that's how love works. You get it even when you haven't earned it yet. He looked at her, eyes full of gratitude. Thank you for giving me this chance. I didn't, she said softly. Sophie did. That night, as David lay awake on the pull-out sofa, he stared at the ceiling and thought about all the nights he'd wasted in silence and ambition. All the years he thought success would fill the spaces in his heart. But nothing, not money, not accolades, not even redemption, could match the moment a little girl forgave him for being too late. He turned onto his side, one hand resting on the book Sophie had made him take with him, The Princess Who Didn't Need Saving. But maybe, just maybe, this time the princess would let the foolish prince try. Not to save her, just to stay, and love, and be loved back. The wind howled that night as rain lashed against the windows of the small apartment. David sat alone on the couch, arms resting on his knees, listening to the storm. He could still feel Sophie's tiny weight curled on his lap from earlier, the trust in her eyes when she handed him the book, and the unfiltered honesty of her bedtime question. His heart still trembled from it. A soft knock on the bedroom door pulled him from his thoughts. It creaked open, and Sophie stepped out, dragging her blanket behind her like a cape. Her eyes were wide, not from fear, but something deeper. "Can I sit with you?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. David nodded and opened his arms. She climbed up beside him, curling into the space where his chest met his arm. The storm raged outside, but the living room felt safe, quiet, sacred. They sat like that for a moment before Sophie whispered, "My friend Molly says her dad left and never came back. She said that's just what dads do." David looked down at her. "That's not what all dads do." Sophie didn't move. "Are you going to leave too? Like her dad? Like the other people?" His breath caught. She wasn't asking out of curiosity. She was asking from a place of scars, invisible to the world, but etched into her soul. "No," he said gently. "I'm not leaving." She tilted her head up to look at him. "But you left before." "I did," he admitted, the shame thick in his throat. "But not because I wanted to. I didn't know about you. I didn't even know your mom was still here. I let my work, my fears, all the wrong things decide what mattered, and that was a mistake." Sophie traced a pattern on his sleeve with her fingertip. "So, if you had known, I would have run here the second I knew," he said, emotion spilling into his voice. "I would have held you the day you were born. I would have helped your mom. I would have made pancakes way earlier, though probably still burned them." She smiled weakly, then asked, "Are you staying forever?" David didn't answer right away. He pulled her closer and rested his cheek against her hair. "Forever, as long as you'll have me." Sophie nodded slowly, then said something that shattered him. "Okay, but if you break your promise, I'll still love you, just maybe a little less." Tears pricked at his eyes. "Fair," he whispered. Eventually she drifted off in his arms, her breathing soft and even. David carried her back to bed and tucked her in beside Isabelle, who stirred just slightly, her hand instinctively reaching for her daughter. He paused at the door, watching the two people who had come to mean more to him than all the empires he'd built. The next morning was different. Sophie woke to the smell of eggs, not burnt, and the sound of music playing low in the kitchen. David stood at the stove, humming off-key as he flipped a batch of French toast. Isabelle, seated nearby with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, laughed at the sight. "What happened to Mr. Pancake Disaster?" she teased. "I watched a video," he said proudly, "and read comments." "Now he's unstoppable," Sophie declared, climbing onto a stool. "But he still sings weird." David winked. "That's part of the charm." Breakfast was simple, but for the first time it felt like a family meal, easy, full of smiles, full of love unspoken. Later, David took Sophie to the park. They sat under a tree while she read from her fairy tale book, her voice rising and falling with each dramatic turn. A few parents glanced their way, some even recognizing him with curious expressions. He didn't care. For once, he wasn't CEO David Montgomery. He was just Sophie's dad. Back at the apartment, he helped Isabelle to the couch and sat beside her. She looked thinner, weaker. "Your coloring's off," he noted gently. "It's a bad day," she murmured. "They come in waves." He offered her water, adjusting her pillow. "We'll get you through it." She looked at him, eyes soft. "I still don't know if I can trust this. Trust you." David nodded. "You don't have to trust me yet. Just let me show up, every day. And if I die before I can?" He closed his eyes, the words cutting deeper than any boardroom betrayal ever could. "Then I'll make sure Sophie never forgets who you were, what you gave up for her. I'll raise her with your heart stitched into everything we do." Tears slid silently down Isabelle's cheeks. She reached for his hand, and for the first time in 10 years, their fingers intertwined. Not in bitterness, not in resentment, but in understanding. "Just promise me one thing," she whispered. "Anything. Don't leave her with questions, not like you left me." David's voice cracked as he responded, "Never again." Outside, the rain had cleared. Inside, something had begun to heal. The days that followed felt both like a blessing and a countdown. David clung to every shared breakfast, every gentle laugh between Sophie and Isabelle, as if memorizing them could stop time. He learned the rhythm of their lives, the early morning coughing fits Isabelle tried to hide, the way Sophie counted stars out loud at night before falling asleep, the subtle gestures that spoke volumes between mother and daughter. But their fragile peace cracked the morning a pale man in an expensive suit arrived at the apartment door. "I'm looking for Mr. David Montgomery," he said, flashing a business card. "Name's Daniel Voss. I represent Catherine Delaney, Isabelle's aunt." David didn't recognize the name at first. Isabelle had rarely spoken of her extended family. But as Voss outlined their intention to seek legal custody of Sophie, David's blood ran cold. "You can't be serious," he said flatly, standing in the doorway like a wall. "I'm afraid we are," Voss replied, voice even. "Ms. Delaney believes Isabelle's condition renders her unfit. And you, Mr. Montgomery, have only recently reappeared. That could suggest ulterior motives. I'm her father. And yet, you've had no role in the girl's life until now. My client believes your interest may be opportunistic. Image rehabilitation, perhaps?" David's jaw clenched. "Tell your client she'll have to say that in court." "We intend to." The door closed, not with a slam, but with a quiet, deliberate finality. Isabelle was resting on the couch when he returned. He knelt beside her, his hand gently brushing hers. "Your aunt's coming after Sophie." She closed her eyes, a sigh of defeat slipping from her lips. "I should have known she'd try something. She always thought I was weak, especially after Mom died." David sat beside her. "We'll fight this." She turned to him slowly. "We? David, you're not listed on Sophie's birth certificate. You're not even in the hospital records. As far as the law's concerned, you're just a man who showed up with a lot of guilt. I'll take a DNA test. I'll hire every lawyer in the city." "No," Isabelle's voice cracked. "Not unless you're doing this because you love her, not because you feel guilty for me." David stood, frustrated. "Of course I love her. Isn't that obvious?" "Then prove it," she said quietly. "Prove to the court, to me, to her." That night, David stood in the living room long after Sophie had gone to bed. He stared out of the window, watching the city buzz beneath him while his heart buzzed with fear. The next morning, he met with Charlotte Grimm, a no-nonsense family attorney with a reputation for fighting like a mother bear. "She's 9, David said after summarizing the situation. "And she's never had a stable father figure, but she knows me now. She trusts me." Judges don't rule on emotional momentum, Grimm replied, scanning documents. They want history, proof of commitment. Then tell me what to do. Start with a petition for paternity, then guardianship. But be warned, custody battles turn ugly fast, especially when a family member claims the high ground. David nodded grimly. I'm not afraid of ugly. I'm afraid of losing her. Meanwhile, Sophie sensed something shifting. At dinner, she quietly picked at her food, stealing glances between her parents. Finally, she blurted out, "Am I going to have to live somewhere else?" Both Isabelle and David looked up in stunned silence. Sophie's voice wobbled. "I heard the man today, and Mom cried when he left." Isabelle reached across the table, squeezing her daughter's hand. "No one is taking you, baby. We're going to fight." David knelt beside her chair. "And if I have to stand in front of the whole world to prove I'm your dad, I will." Sophie studied his eyes, her own filling with tears. "I just want to stay with you, both of you." Isabelle pulled her close, whispering, "You will." In the days that followed, David did everything Charlotte suggested. He submitted to testing, filled out every form, provided character references, and even began writing a personal statement for the court, something Charlotte hadn't requested but which he insisted on including. Isabelle grew weaker, Sophie grew quieter, and David grew fiercer. One night, Isabelle called for him. He found her sitting up in bed, pale but lucid. "David," she whispered, "if anything happens to me before this hearing—" "Don't," he interrupted, his voice frayed. "Let me say this," she insisted, tears threatening. "You've changed. I've seen it in Sophie's laughter, in the way she leans into you now. That little girl loves you, whether she's ready to say it or not. So don't let anyone take her away, not for a second. Promise me." He held her hand tightly, his own shaking. "I promise." The next morning, he found a sealed envelope beside her on the nightstand with a note. "To be opened only if the court needs to hear the truth." David slid it into his jacket pocket, a silent vow forming in his heart. He had lost Isabelle once to ambition. He would not lose their daughter to fear. The courtroom wasn't grand. It was modest, even dull. Beige walls, scuffed floors, flickering overhead lights. But to David, it felt like the most sacred place on earth. Because what would be decided here wasn't just law. It was love. It was future. It was whether he got to stay in his daughter's life. Isabelle was too weak to attend. The kidney failure had taken its toll, and she remained home under hospice care. But David had come prepared, with his heart in his hands and every ounce of truth he could offer. Across the aisle sat Catherine Delaney, perfectly composed in a tailored suit, her attorney at her side. She gave David a cold, thin-lipped smile, the kind of smile that said, "I'm doing this for her own good." David didn't return it. Sophie, dressed in her best navy dress and holding a stuffed bunny tightly in her lap, sat between Ruth and David's attorney, Charlotte Grimm. She looked smaller than usual, her knees swinging above the courtroom floor, but her eyes searched the room with quiet bravery. The judge entered. A woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for being fair but unsentimental. She wasted no time. "We're here to address a petition for guardianship of minor Sophie Montgomery, currently residing with her mother, Isabelle Montgomery, and petitioner David Montgomery, biological father. Custody is being contested by Ms. Catherine Delaney." Catherine's attorney opened with polite ferocity. "Your Honor, my client is deeply concerned about the child's welfare. Ms. Montgomery is terminally ill. Mr. Montgomery, though biologically related, has only been involved in the child's life for a few short weeks. His history of absence, combined with his sudden reappearance, raises serious questions about his intentions." David's jaw tightened. He stared straight ahead. We believe it would be in Sophie's best interest, the attorney concluded, to be placed with a family member who has long-standing ties and the resources to support her, without the emotional instability of a man who walked away once before. Charlotte stood calmly when it was her turn. Your Honor, Mr. Montgomery has made mistakes. He acknowledges that. But in the past weeks, he has demonstrated profound emotional commitment, legal compliance, and a willingness to prioritize Sophie over everything, including his multi-million-dollar career. His relationship with the child is blossoming. Their bond is real. The judge turned to David. Mr. Montgomery, do you have anything to say before we continue? He rose slowly, buttoned his blazer, and stepped forward. I could give you charts, records, financial statements, he began, voice steady, but none of that tells you who I am now, or who I want to be for her. He glanced at Sophie, who met his eyes with something fragile and trusting. I spent years chasing the kind of success that earns headlines, and in doing so, I walked away from the woman I loved. I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know she needed me. I found out by accident, by grace, and I will never stop thanking whatever power brought me back. He paused, swallowing hard. I didn't come to court to defend my wealth or my worth on paper. I came because there's a little girl who calls me Daddy now, and because when she asks if I'll leave like some of her friends' fathers, I can say with absolute certainty, never. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock. Your Honor, Charlotte said softly, we also have a letter, Isabelle Montgomery's written testimony. She hoped to be here in person, but her health no longer permits it. The judge nodded. Submit it. David pulled the sealed envelope from his jacket. His hands shook slightly as he passed it forward. The judge opened the letter and read it silently. The room held its breath. My client respectfully requests the letter be read into the record, Charlotte added. The judge nodded again and read aloud. To whom it may concern, I've known many kinds of love in my life, the kind that lifts you and the kind that leaves you. David Montgomery was once the latter, but today he's the former again. He's changed. I see it in the way Sophie runs to him, how she holds his hand a little tighter each time. I hear it in the way he says her name like a prayer. He's made more difference in her life in a few short weeks than I could have dreamed. He is not perfect, but he is hers, and I trust him with what I love most in this world. Please let him be the one to carry her forward. With all my heart, Isabelle Montgomery. The judge placed the letter down gently. Thank you. Catherine's attorney whispered something urgently, but the judge silenced him with a look. Court will recess for 1 hour while I review all submitted materials. Mr. Montgomery, Ms. Delaney, please remain available. David sat back down, his heart pounding. Sophie leaned over and whispered, Did we do okay? He nodded, voice thick. You did perfect, sweetheart. As the judge exited, Charlotte gently rested her hand on David's shoulder. Win or lose, she said quietly, that was the most honest testimony I've ever seen. He gave a faint smile. I didn't come to impress. I came to love. Outside the windows, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden beams across the courtroom floor. David took it as a sign. He would fight with every breath left in him. Because some promises weren't made in court, they were made with the heart, and his had already spoken. The verdict came just after 3:00 p.m., in a courtroom that had grown still with anticipation. Judge Whitaker returned to the bench, her expression unreadable as she glanced between David and Catherine. Sophie sat with her legs swinging quietly beneath the bench, gripping the sleeve of Ruth's cardigan. This decision is never easy, the judge began, her voice calm but weighty, especially when a child's future is being shaped not just by facts, but by faith, in people, in love, in change. David's chest tightened. He reached for Sophie's hand without thinking. She squeezed back. After reviewing all evidence, witness testimonies, and the personal letter submitted by the child's mother, the judge looked directly at David. I find that the most stable, nurturing, and emotionally bonded placement for Sophie Montgomery is with her biological father, Mr. David Montgomery. The room seemed to exhale. Sophie blinked, confused for a moment. Then David's arms were around her, and she melted into his chest with a gasp of relief. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," he whispered, voice trembling. "You kept your promise," she whispered back, eyes shining. Catherine Delaney stood, lips pressed tight. "I hope, for Sophie's sake, you mean it," she said stiffly before turning to leave. David didn't look back. His focus was entirely on the little girl in his arms. He kissed the top of her head, still overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Charlotte leaned in, smiling softly. "It's over, David. You did it." He nodded, but in his heart he knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. They returned home to Isabelle that evening. She lay in the small hospice bed in the apartment's sunroom, her body frail, but her spirit still luminous. A nurse adjusted her blankets as Sophie ran to her side, holding her hand gently. "Mom," Sophie whispered, "we won." Isabelle opened her eyes, and when they met David's, something unspoken passed between them. Relief, gratitude, and a bittersweet kind of peace. "You kept your word," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I will always keep it," he said, kneeling beside her. "No more running. No more choosing ambition over love." A faint smile curved her lips. "It's funny. All those years, I wondered what would happen if you came back. And now, I'm just glad you're here." Sophie rested her head on her mother's shoulder, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Don't go yet," she said softly. "Not tonight." Isabelle's hand moved to stroke her daughter's hair, trembling but tender. "I'll stay as long as I can, baby. But if I can't, your dad will be there. Every day, every bedtime, every school concert." David couldn't speak. He could only hold Isabelle's hand and pray the moment would last. That night, David sat on the edge of Sophie's bed, reading from her favorite storybook. His voice cracked as he read the part where the princess saves her father, not the other way around. "You okay?" she asked, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. He chuckled quietly. "Yeah, just learning what matters. Mom says stories help people remember who they are." "She's right," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "And what are you going to be when you grow up?" "A writer," she said immediately, like Mom wanted to be before she got sick. David smiled. "Then write stories that remind people they're not alone, like you reminded me." Sophie reached over, took his hand, and whispered, "You can be in them too. Maybe you're the dad who learns how to bake without burning stuff." "Maybe," he said with a teary laugh, "but only if you promise not to laugh when I mess up." "No promises," she teased. Then she leaned in and kissed his cheek. "I love you, Daddy." It was the first time she'd said it, and David felt something break and heal all at once inside him. "I love you more, Sophie. Always." As she drifted to sleep, David stood at the doorway, watching her, a quiet sense of awe filling his heart. Behind him, Isabelle's breathing was growing shallower by the hour. The nurse had told him the time was near. David returned to her side, sitting quietly as the city lights outside the window flickered against the walls. Isabelle stirred, eyes opening one final time. "Did she say it?" she asked faintly. David nodded, overcome. "She said she loves me." Isabelle's lips parted in the softest smile. "Told you. She's always been wiser than us." She closed her eyes again, her hand still in his. "She has your heart," he whispered, "and I'll spend the rest of my life honoring that." That night, long after the world had fallen asleep, Isabelle passed peacefully. But the next morning, as the sun rose through streaked windows, Sophie came into the living room, her stuffed bunny in hand, and found David quietly writing at the kitchen counter. She walked over, climbed into his lap, and leaned her head on his chest. "What are you writing?" she asked, her voice sleepy. "A letter to your mom," he said softly, "to tell her we're okay, that I'm going to keep my promise." She wrapped her arms around him, and he held her back, like a man who finally understood what forever meant. 3 months later, the winter chill gave way to a gentler spring, but the ache of Isabelle's absence still clung to David like a quiet shadow. He'd kept his promise. Every bedtime, every school pickup, every lost tooth celebration. But some nights, when the house fell silent and Sophie's laughter no longer echoed down the hall, the grief returned, uninvited but familiar. Still, in those quiet hours, David often found himself staring at the photo of Isabelle on the fireplace mantel, her smile immortalized, her eyes forever lit with that quiet, fierce hope. He spoke to her often, not aloud but in small ways, in the way he folded Sophie's clothes, in the way he stopped to help strangers, in the way he listened, even when it hurt. Sophie, for her part, had grown more open, more radiant. She still had nights where the sadness crept in, where she'd crawl into his bed and whisper, "I miss her." But now, she always added, "But I'm glad I have you." Tonight was different. It was the one they'd been planning for weeks, Isabelle's legacy night. The name had been Sophie's idea. "Because she left us something," she said solemnly, tapping her heart. "So we should share it." David had rented out a small community theater, the same one where Isabelle once read poetry in her 20s. Sophie, ever meticulous, helped design the flyers. "A night of stories and songs in honor of someone who lived with love," the banner read. The seats filled fast. Friends, nurses, even Ruth, who had become a second grandmother to Sophie. A few of David's former colleagues from Montgomery Investments arrived too, many still stunned by his sudden retirement. "I traded shares for story time," he'd quipped in interviews. "Best decision I ever made." Now, as the lights dimmed, Sophie stood nervously backstage, a folder clutched in her small hands. "You're going to do great," David whispered, kneeling beside her. "Just read it from your heart." "I wrote it for her, but it's really for you," she whispered, her eyes shining. He kissed her forehead. "Then I already know it's perfect." The curtain rose. A spotlight bathed Sophie in a warm glow as she stepped onto the stage. The microphone seemed to dwarf her, but she adjusted it with a confidence far beyond her years. "This is called The Sandwich Story," she began, her voice steady, sincere. "It's about a girl who sold sandwiches in the cold, but it's really about how she found her dad." Laughter rippled gently through the crowd. "Once, there was a man who forgot how to be happy. He had money and houses but didn't have someone to say goodnight to. Then, one day, he met a little girl with a photo, and everything changed. He didn't fix everything right away, but he tried really hard. He made funny pancakes, and he read bedtime stories in silly voices, and he held her hand when she cried." Sophie paused. David sat in the front row, completely still. He didn't run away this time, he stayed. And the girl learned that sometimes love doesn't show up when you want it to, but when it finally comes, you hold it with both hands. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. When Sophie finished, the standing ovation wasn't just for her words, it was for everything that had led to this moment, for the mistakes turned to redemption, for the broken hearts that learned to heal. Later, as they walked through the parking lot hand in hand, Sophie looked up at her father. "Can I tell you something weird?" "Always." I don't think she's really gone. David blinked back the sting in his eyes. What do you mean? I think she's still watching, like she saw the show. He smiled softly. Then I hope she saw your ending. Sophie grinned, swinging their hands. I'm writing a new story next. This one's about a princess who builds a house with her dad, and she gets to pick all the paint colors. That sounds terrifying, David teased. Do I get a say? Nope, she said firmly, but you do get a hug. She wrapped her arms around him, tight and warm. They stood like that for a long moment under the stars, the world spinning quietly around them. That night, back home, Sophie placed a drawing beside Isabelle's photo. It was simple, a house with 2 windows, 1 heart in each. Beneath it, she had written, For Mom, you started our story. We're writing the rest. David tucked her into bed, kissed her goodnight, and whispered, Thank you, sweetheart. For what? She mumbled, already half asleep. For reminding me what love looks like. She smiled sleepily. I'll remind you again tomorrow. As David turned off the light, he paused at the door, glancing once more at the drawing, at the picture, at the life that had bloomed from a forgotten corner of the city and a cold sand